Hello and welcome to yet another virtual event with Tattered Cover. If you don't know, Tattered Cover is the largest independent bookstore in Colorado and one of the largest in the nation. And we are actually celebrating our 50th anniversary, and it's due to readers like you and writers like tonight's guest who have supported us for half a century. So thank you so much. My name is Adam. I am the director of events with Tattered Cover, and tonight we have a really special conversation I'm really excited about. But before I get started, I want to let you know that there is closed captioning at the bottom of your YouTube screen. It's a button that says CC. You can click it and you'll have closed captioning for the entire night. Tonight's guest was born and raised in Brooklyn. She's had a long career in print, radio, television, and online journalism. She has worked at the New York Times, Marketplace, MSNBC, and KCRW. She's the author of 3 previous books: Radio Shangri-La, Ray and Joan, and Up All Night, Ted Turner, CNN, and the Birth of 24-Hour News. Her latest book is Susan, Linda, Nina, and Koki, the extraordinary story of the founding mothers of NPR. Her name is Lisa Napoli. Lisa, welcome to Tattered Cover Virtual Events. How are you doing tonight?
Thank you for having me. I think I came on a little bit too early. I hope I didn't steal the drama, but thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. I was telling you before we started that I launched my first book at Tattered Cover about 10 years ago. So it's so exciting to be back with you. I wish we were in person, but
it's such a pleasure to have you. And like the fact that you have come back to Tattered Cover means a lot to us and to we have someone who said hello from Saudi Arabia. So we have people from all over the world tonight listening to this event. Lisa, I always start with this. What is your book about? Tell me, what's the elevator pitch?
Sure. Well, as you mentioned, this is my second book that's really explicitly about the creation of media and this crazy media universe that we live in today that dominates our lives. Really has captivated me both in my career, as you described, but also now as I write books. So this book is about the creation of NPR and the 4 women who helped put it on the map. And, there's sort of a terrific dramatic through line that almost brought NPR down in its 12th year. So it really is just the creation of public broadcasting through the lens of these 4 women set against the exciting backdrop of the 1970s when women were not allowed to do all the things that we're allowed to do today.
And usually 90% of the time when I talk to an author, I get the chance to read the book, but because of things that happened before this, I haven't read this book. So I have so many questions that I feel readers who haven't read it might want to know.
Sure.
And when we read the book, they will get a more in-depth experience. What drew you? You've written about media before, Ted Turner, CNN, 24-Hour News, the ticker going across 24/7. What drew you to these 4 women and NPR specifically?
Well, after I finished the book about how Ted Turner started CNN, which was released on the 40th anniversary of CNN, I was just interested in looking at media history from a different angle. And NPR was turning 50 this year. It turned 50 officially on May 3rd, launched on May 3rd, 1971. So that seemed like a cool next book. And then when I realized that I could tell that story through the lens of these 4 women who, for many people, especially people who are a little bit older than me, remember listening to all across the nation on in tiny little markets, much smaller than Denver, people were tuning in to this new network, not knowing what it was, not used to hearing something on the lower band of the FM dial. I think it's not TV. And these women just put the place on the map. So it just seemed like a really interesting confluence of the women's movement, the birth of public broadcasting, and these 4 particular women whose names became synonymous with NPR. And for some people, they still are. For the longtime listeners, they still are.
The synopsis of the book is, in the years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, women in the workplace still have found themselves relegated to secretarial positions or locked out of jobs entirely. In your research, I guess, and I'm assuming this is in the book a lot, but what drove these women to create something That's really groundbreaking. Like you said, people were not used to something like this.
Well, it's so funny because the really inelegant answer to that is that when NPR started, it had very, very little budget. And nobody knew what it was going to be or how it was going to work or what it was going to really actually sound like. And so these women were able to get jobs at this place in large part because no one else wanted to work there. It's hard to imagine today because people vie professionally to get their foot in the door to do anything at NPR, much less on the air. But back in 1971, in particular, Susan Stamberg and Linda Wertheimer were the first two of the four women I write about to be there. They were there at the beginning. Before the beginning, they helped shape it, and they were willing to go work for next to no money. They were able to work for next to no money because they were married to men who made decent livings. But NPR, in turn, was willing to take a chance on women. And most, well, it's not just in broadcasting, but I focus on broadcasting here. In most parts of the world, women could only go so far. They weren't expected to get educations, and they certainly weren't expected to go on the air and deliver the news. So it was really just an accident of timing that this network was starting up, and there were some progressive people who were willing to break convention and give the opportunity for women to do something either behind the scenes or in front of the microphone that most other broadcasters. And it's important to remember that in the 70s, there weren't that many other broadcasters. It's not like today where we have a multiplicity of media choices. The broadcasting universe then, the media universe then was very, very simple. It was three major television networks that owned radio components. And then there were local stations, and then there were many newspapers, but even in newspapers, women couldn't get good byline jobs. They were relegated to the women's section, writing about society and weddings and women's news, ladies' news, it was called. So it was a different world then, and these women were able to, by accident, as I say, waltz into this place. And made the most of that opportunity.
When did NPR become, like in that timeline, when did it, like how quickly did it take it for NPR to be taken seriously?
Years. And a large part of what got it to become a household name were these four women. Susan Stamberg became in 1972. She was hired as a production assistant, but she became the first woman to co-anchor a nightly network news show at all, and so these women helped put NPR on the map because of their voice. And it is really hard to imagine that there was a time that you wouldn't hear women delivering the news. But when Susan Stamberg was put in that co-host chair, people around the nation were startled if they could even receive NPR, because NPR wasn't as widespread as it is today. It was licensed to stations that were licensed to carry it were usually attached to universities, and they were little low budget affairs. So it took about a dozen years for NPR to really ramp up. And it's only, 10 years after that. It's so funny, the similarities between the NPR story and the CNN story in terms of acceptance, because it took both of them. It wasn't overnight that they became household names and influential. It took a long while in each case for various technologies to take hold that made it possible for people to even receive them, much less to take them seriously as news organizations.
And you explained a lot about why it took so long. Did it having to do with being set up by women or run by women, was that part of?
Oh, no, it wasn't run. I have to be clear. It wasn't run by women.
Okay.
The women were on the air. So Susan Stamberg was the co-host. Yes. Linda Wertheimer became a reporter and later a host. Nina, of course, is still a very famous reporter covering the Supreme Court and other justice issues. And Cokie was on the air. So the women didn't run it, but because they were the public voice of it, not the only people on the air, but they were dominant there. And they were all very close and friends. And that's what I chronicle in this book too, is their deep friendship with with each other. So they weren't running it, but they were working, they were this public face, if
Yeah.
you will. And because they were so prominent in the community in Washington, or became prominent in the community, people looked to them as synonymous with
Yes.
NPR.
And that's kind of, I guess I misspoke because I feel like up until recently, maybe I'm mistaken, but until Ted Turner, no one thought about who ran things. It was, Peter Jennings, Walter Cronkite. It was the people, it was the reporters they were the company. So I guess that's why I misspoke.
Well, no, and that's a really good point, because
Yeah.
that's what's so interesting about writing media history, is that I think it's so important. And all of my books look at the origin stories of important institutions or places. In the case of my first book, it's about the tiny kingdom of Bhutan. But I find it really fascinating to look at how iconic brands, and particularly in our national conversation, as we look at how the media indelibly has influenced what's happened in our society over the last decade, after the last many decades,
Yeah.
but the focus has been on the presidential mess and all of that. So to understand how media work, and to know that it isn't the people who you see who are making all the shots, calling all the shots, or the orchestrators of the place, but yet they are enormously important public faces of them. So
Yeah, in general, I'm obsessed with media. Before I worked as director of events, I wrote for a pop culture magazine, but my focus in college, I mean, I studied to be a teacher, but all my electives were all about media and new media and blogs. And because I graduated college in 2011, so things were really shifting. Let me backtrack, I guess. That was a little personal thing about me, why I'm obsessed with media. Why so much media? Why CNN? Why NPR? What dragged you into this world that you want to write so much about it?
Well, it's so interesting. I graduated from college in 1984, and my first job as a teenager, as an intern, was at CNN, the New York bureau. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York,
Mhm.
and I was just desperate to work in the media, because I loved the idea of breaking out of the world into which I was born, which wasn't particularly fancy, and having a perch by which to ask questions. So I got this internship at this place, CNN, in 1981, when no one knew what it was, because most of the country wasn't yet wired for cable television. So now here I am in my 50s, looking back on my life, and happy to have escaped the newfangled journalism world as it is today, because it's not my thing, and becoming a historian. I'm looking back. For many years I was a technology reporter, and I'm so intrigued by how technology of all sorts, whether it's a road or Zoom, like we're talking to each other right now, changed our entire society and our culture. And so for me, as somebody who's worked as a journalist for all these years, now I'm reflecting back and thinking, oh my God, I worked at all of these places as they were ramping up. And when we were working at CNN, when I graduated from college, I moved to Atlanta and worked at CNN's then headquarters. We didn't think, oh, we're pioneers. We thought, we are making less than minimum wage, working overnights. We're having so much fun learning how to make TV news and help create what TV news is. But we never thought, who started this? How did it get started? And so many years later, here I am. It was actually after my second book, which is about the creation of McDonald's and Ray and Joan Kroc. Really, it's about Joan Kroc, the amazing philanthropist who rescued NPR financially. But after I wrote this book, a colleague of mine from CNN, my early career, with whom I'm still friends, wrote to me and said, you really should write a book about the 40th anniversary of CNN, because people just don't know the story of how it almost didn't work. It almost didn't happen. And people are forgetting Ted Turner and how huge and important and influential he was. So that's why I wrote that book. It was so interesting to go back. It's like doing genealogical research on your own family and finding out that your grandmother ran a saloon somewhere.
Yeah.
I just had no idea how it works. So that's a long way of saying I'm just interested in looking at this media landscape that dominates our world that I've been a part of for so long and that I've never had the chance to step back and reflect on, because I think they're important little histories that we need to know, rich histories. I don't mean to diminish them by calling
No,
them.
of course. Yeah, I find it so fascinating because, like I said, I am obsessed with media, and I see, especially today, so many people, the media is lying to us or whoever. There's people who say that, and
Oh
of
yeah.
course, most news channels are obviously trying to make a profit. It's a business, but it's interesting to see where it came from, and it's always
Right.
been a part of my life. Like you said, you started in 1981. I was in 7th grade when September 11th happened, when like the news ticker was invented. Sorry about that.
Right.
And
Right.
so it's always been a part of my life, and I'm so fascinated on how we got here to this.
Well, then you're going to love my books, but you're also this book that first brought me to Tattered Cover is all about how the little tiny kingdom of Bhutan that didn't have didn't have television until 1999. How old were you in 1999?
I was 10.
Yeah. Okay. So imagine if you were born into a world that didn't even have TV, and Bhutan didn't, and they finally got it. And then a little under 10 years later, I, by accident, met a guy at a cocktail party who got me invited to help start a radio station in Bhutan, which I knew only because it didn't have TV, but I knew nothing about it. So I went there as a volunteer to help start this radio station, and basically saw this entire kingdom, which isn't very big, it's just 750,000 people, learning how to use the media and learning how the media reflects society. And it was mind-blowing for me as somebody who grew up in the United States in the 60s, 70s, 80s, today, watching, babies are born and they're staring at a screen, unfortunately, minutes later, right? So we're just raised with it. And to be in this place that didn't have it until relatively recently, and to meet people my own age who were like my late grandfather, who didn't grow up with television either because it wasn't invented then, it's fascinating to think about how it changes a culture. And that's really what I chronicle in this book, Radio Shangri-La. So I hope you'll read all my books, because I think if you're a media junkie, you're going to find them interesting.
And it's so funny. So like I said, I normally devour the books, or I try to, and this was one. So where I am at now, we are having like our celebratory staff party, and I was like, I'm going to go into this private room so I can host this event. I didn't want to give it to anyone else because I wanted to make sure I could talk to you. So now I want to look. I know we're talk about your books, but I feel like I don't have a chance to talk to people like you often. So,
let's do it.
As a media historian, you technology journalist, where do we go from here? What's the next step? 24-hour news, TikTok is around, Facebook is trying to be its own news source sometimes. Where do you see news going?
It's so funny because to answer where we're going, I think it's so good to look back. Yeah. And back at the start of my career, the big conversation was what's going to happen if people are able to vet the news themselves or create the news themselves. That was a big conversation in the 80s. The worry was that, people... What was the big thing in journalism? Is news what you need to know or what you want to know? If I only want to know everything there is to know about hockey and pastrami, you literally could do that today, right? You could go online and subscribe to threads and Reddits and Twitter feeds and TikToks and just about those two things and never know anything else that's going on. And that moment, that we talked about 30, 40 years ago has arrived. And the idea that you never have to wait for anything. If I'm not a futurist, I am a historian, so I don't know how it can go, but I do know that back when I was at the New York Times and the New York Times introduced color to its front page, people were freaking out. Can you imagine that? People literally were freaking out that the old gray lady, as it was called, had gone color, much less now. You can watch incredible documentaries on the New York Times site. I was part of this groundbreaking group of people who were just experimenting with the new medium.
Yeah.
And so I've seen it every step of the way. I also worked at a little place called Q2, which was an offshoot of QVC, pre-internet, where people were buying things by placing phone calls, which was radical and revolutionary. So I don't know. I mean, maybe the next time you and I talk, if I have a new book in a couple of years, people will just be able to click on this site and buy a book, and it'll link to every other interview I'd ever done and every sideline story there is about the subject of the book. I don't know, but the technology is amazing. And I know really what's most important is the fundamental distrust that people have in the media now, and this this political allegiance people have. It's really upsetting because it's so completely different than what journalism was when I started. So
Do you feel prior to the last presidential administration, like fake news and this phenomenon, was that a thing, or did that
yes.
really get invented by 2016? Okay.
No, that's the other thing why history is so great. I have yet to write about it, but if you go further back, before pre-broadcasting, pre-radio and television broadcasting, back when all there were newspapers, their newspapers were polarizing. If you read one newspaper and I read the other, that was a political statement because the newspapers were infused with politics, and there was all kinds of rumor mongering and spin. I mean, spin, there's nothing new about spin,
Okay.
but what is new is the speed with which it accelerates. And because my generation wasn't programmed to think of news as biased, because by the time I came of age, that long ago world of newspapers having a political point of view was gone. And so now, my generation stepped into this crazy new world, and everything as it accelerated just allowed bad and good stuff to spread. So that's the important thing to think, is that Donald Trump didn't invent fake news, and the people around him, his supporters, didn't make it up. Basically what they did was they forced this issue. They forced other cable networks to change their tune and created chaos. But that chaos is not new. It's what's new is the technology and the speed with which that bad stuff travels.
Yeah, you're absolutely right with technology. I mean, the first thing I do I use TweetDeck, and for those who don't know it, it's Twitter, but you can have multiple columns. And I have like my news sources that I want to see in one, that I want to see though, not everything. But so I can curate it. And back when like broadcast was first starting, NBC, CBS, ABC, they owned everything, three things. Now it's 3 million people who own things.
Right. You can be my source for news if I want you to be. But, it's also interesting to think back. If you look at, and I don't know if anybody's read the books, I'm sure you stock them, or people you'll get them for people, about the pandemic of 1918. Mm-hmm. And if you look at the pandemic time, pre-broadcasting, I mean, radio was around, but not the way, it wasn't a major force. It wasn't yet a commercial force. But if you look at the last pandemic 100 years ago, and the fake news that traveled around that, the misinformation, the governmental blunders that happened, and the populist blunders and idiocy that happened, it'll make you feel better simply to know that humanity has always been bad and good. It's not inherently one or the other. But really reading about the pandemic of 1980, as I was freaking out in the very beginning of it, I was scouring around for historians and medical history and all of that. And it was mind-blowing how similar the junk that happened this time went that time, with, of course, a major difference being that a vaccine could never have been developed as quickly as it was, and not much less deployed. But even the pandemic itself didn't spread quite as quickly in the beginning as it does now with travel. But looking back, you learn so much about where we are today. It's just patterns.
And that's what history, and I know you are a historian, is so interesting to me. In addition to media, it's just how secular everything is. You're like,
absolutely.
And I feel like people out there, and I'm talking to my friends on Facebook, or my family on Facebook. It's different than my friends on Facebook, who I will send this to because I feel like so many people who are just out there using social media. It's a form of media. It's a form of NPR, like, Susan, Linda, Nina, and Koki. It's a form of Ted Turner. All the books you've written about social media is this new form of it, and people need to be educated on it. And I feel like
Right.
people don't realize that this is something that I don't know if high schools are talking about media, Ted Turner, NPR. I feel like they need to be.
You're so right. No, no. In fact, in Bhutan, what was so interesting is that there were people, the elders were so worried about the influence of television on the young people, much less radio and social media and all of that, that there was a movement to educate, to create a media literacy task force to teach people how to read and understand what they were hearing over the airwaves. One example is they brought in India's its closest neighbor, and they brought in an Indian channel. I think it was a sports channel. And there'd never been a behavioral problem with kids in schools in Bhutan until this channel came in, and kids started beating each other up because they were watching wrestling. And so they were mimicking what they were seeing on TV. And it was the same. The whole book is about how the consumer culture that we're, barraged with from every direction was pummeling the culture of Bhutan, the ancient culture, because people just wanted to mimic what they saw on television. So what's interesting about this book I've just written with Susan, Linda, Nina, and Koki is that now, diversity is the buzzword. And in the 70s, women could not get jobs, not just women of color, not just people of color, women, half the population, more than half the population did not have equal rights in many different ways. And so that's a really interesting thing for people, I think, to know and to understand that the 1970s, not that long ago, women couldn't get their own bank accounts.
Yeah.
Imagine. So, yeah.
And looping back to this book, I also, we were talking before, I talk to authors a lot, literary authors, fiction authors, and I talk a lot about the craft. But as you're writing this, as you're researching this, what's your not strategy? Yeah, what's your strategy? How did you want to formulate this story? Because with nonfiction, the truth is out there. You have to tell it in an interesting way, but it exists,
Exactly. It's not the fun of it is a lot of fun for somebody like me, but for a fiction writer who just daydreams and then figures out how to stitch it together, it really is the same process. The difference is that mine is not coming from inspiration, mine is coming from facts. And so I take these facts, factual incidents, and I'm very proud that people praise my finding these quirky details of history, and I find them and I amass them, and then I figure out how to stitch them together in a way that's exciting. I don't want it to be boring. I want it to read like a literary book, which I hope it is, and people compliment it all the time. So I feel great that you can take these facts, and in this case, it's the facts of these four women coming together in this decade at this new place. And then this man comes along named Frank Mankiewicz, the third president of NPR, in the late 70s, and they think they've arrived. Now they really think that they've hit the big time, and he almost kills the place. So the facts of the story, as you amass them, as you go to archives or watch endless videos or read books or dig up old newspaper articles, all of which I did, and then talk to people as well, all of which I did endlessly for the book, putting it together, it all clicks into place. And it's a really, for anybody who's interested in media history, but especially if they like NPR, or even if they hate NPR, I think they'll really appreciate the backstory of how NPR came to be.
And to be honest with you, as someone who listens to NPR, who has NPR, that's my first podcast I listen to in the morning, Up First, their 15-minute podcast. I knew nothing about these four ladies. And I read the prologue because I have a copy. I didn't read the whole book, but it's like this is something that I can't believe wasn't told when NPR blew up with Serial, the podcast, like 5 years ago. I'm surprised everyone wasn't jumping on this, and it took a historian like you, a writer like you, to bring this to life. And it's like, thank you. First of all, as a fan, thank you.
I think you'll enjoy the rest of it. And it is really, that is the fun. I talk with biographers and memoirists all the time, study it, and all of us are looking for those little gem stories that haven't been told. Even if it's about a figure that is well known, we're always looking for the offbeat or the unusual or the story that seems so obvious we can't believe that no one has told it. So
Yeah, I can't believe no one's told us. And just from reading the prologue and talking to you and whoever is out there listening, I hope you can see Lisa's passion, because that's what's important with nonfiction, the passion, because then it really oozes out on the page.
you gotta love writing these books because there's not a lot of money in them, and the big thrill is people. I mean, really, with this book too, with the CNN story, I've heard from so many people who worked in the early days of CNN and more contemporary times, and they had no idea that CNN, what they went through, how it got created. And it's not a boring, wonky story. It's actually a really interesting story. And Ted Turner is a wild character. So there's some
Oh yeah.
wild characters in the NPR book too. So yeah, I hope everyone will check them out and buy them from you.
Of course, down to cover. I put them in the link on the YouTube. I put a link to the NPR book that we're talking about tonight, but I also just put our entire page of Lisa's work. So please check that out. A question from the audience is always, what's next? But I don't want to ask that. I just want to ask, what interests you that you may write about or you won't write about, but you wish someone else wrote about?
Well, there's a couple things. I would really love to write the story of my father, who had a hit show in the 1970s in Brooklyn, New York, that then flopped, or then didn't take him where he thought it would. And that is something that's, I was a kid when it was happening and I've never really understood it. And I love looking at history. So I'd love to look at 70s Brooklyn,
Yes.
because it was a different place than it is today. But I'm also really, I hope one day I can tell the story of what happened at the New York Times when I worked there at that strange moment in time when everything was starting to go digital, because that was a really exciting time. And my colleagues and I just were strangers in a weird land. Nobody really understood what we were doing except the people who were reading our stories. So
Yeah.
those are two things, but I'll probably go a little bit further back in time for my next book. So hopefully I'll get that together soon.
Yes, I hope so too. And that way we can do this in person once we figure out our lives. So that's what
Yes.
I'll say.
Good. Good.
Lisa, thanks so much. That I incorporated some audience questions into what I was asking as we were going, just to make it flow a little better.
Oh, good.
I could talk to you forever. I love the media, and I know we have emailed before this, so don't
Keep in touch.
don't. I will send an email just about me wanting to learn more. Um, where can we find you on the internet for those who don't know, who just stumbled onto this stream? Where should we find you?
Sure. lisanapoli.com is a good place to see about my books and a little bit about me, and drop me an email, lisa@lisanapoli.com. And lisanapoli.com has all my background there. So yeah.
Thank you so much. Like I said, I could talk to you forever. The audience, like I said at the beginning, someone was here from Saudi Arabia. We have people all over the world who are here tonight at this Denver bookstore because of you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. That's fantastic. I love it.
And like, we are Tattered Cover. Find us at tatteredcover.com. If you're interested in more events, tatteredcover.com/events will get you right there. This YouTube video will be live for Lisa and for everyone. We will send this out via email to everyone registered. So please share it. Please share Lisa's work. Please buy all of Lisa's books, especially from us, all four of them. They all look amazing. As we were talking, I literally bought books from my own bookstore to make sure I can get them. So
Excellent.
yes. Lisa, thank you. Have a great evening. I know you're on the East Coast, so thank you for staying up with us.
My pleasure. Have a good rest of the summer, everyone. And
Amazing.
I'm happy to read these books to you too if you do audio, but there you go.
There we go. All right, everyone. Have a
Thanks
great
again.
evening to all the readers out there.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.